Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, November 30th, 2022, and today we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators the last few days. And as we do each week, we take our news stories from the SMIE Consulting newsletter that comes out on Monday mornings, and that's called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And I'm dropping the links to the most recent edition of the newsletter, as well as our SMIE Consulting website, where you can subscribe to the newsletter if you're not already subscribed, if you prefer it in email format. And we also make that available through LinkedIn, through their newsletter services as well. And there are over 800 subscribers on that newsletter on LinkedIn, another 100 or so on the email version. So please do subscribe to that, because that'll get you all of the stories that we cover potentially in these questions we answer. On Wednesday afternoon, you'll get those in your inbox on Monday mornings. Those are our quick takes on Monday, and we go a little bit more in depth into some of those key issues that we see coalescing around a few different news stories each week. So please do subscribe. Thanks again to those that are watching live here on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter. Really glad to be a part of your weekly international edification. We always try and make this interactive as possible. We appreciate, though, that many of you can't watch live and that you're watching on repeat on any of those social channels or downloading the audio-only podcast version. So thanks again to those that have subscribed over the last 4 years to make this podcast adventure really worth the effort on my part. So thanks again. Today we're going to answer three questions, as I mentioned earlier. The first one is the UK about to muck up a really good thing? And I did say muck up a really good thing. And this all centers around recent news that's come out from number 10 with the new government in charge under Rishi Sunak, who has had members of his cabinet, particularly Home Secretary Suella Braverman, be very critical of the increase in the net migration figures, which have impacted obviously services and everything else that the UK government provides to migrants to the UK. The challenge has been that university students have increasingly made up a larger percentage in the past year of that net migration figure stat. The numbers, if you're wondering what those are, we're talking about close to a record 500,000 folks, migrants to the UK that are now that is up substantially over years past. From let's see, we're looking at that last year we're talking about 504,000 more people are estimated to have moved to the UK than left in the 12 months to June 22, up sharply from 173,000 in the year to June 21. So that's clearly well over 325,000 extra folks have doubled, basically, more than double the number that have come, triple almost, the number of migrants that have come to the UK in the last year. Now, the Office of National Statistics in the UK has said that this jump was driven by unique factors, including visa schemes for Ukrainian and Hong Kong citizens and students arriving from outside the European Union. So the question is, of that 504,000, that's not all students, that's overall net migration. Many university officials in the UK for years have claimed, have rightly said, that these are students, they're not migrants, they're here to do a degree. Yes, they can stay if they want after they're done with their degree for 2-year post-study work now. But they've asked that these students be excluded from that net migrations because it draws, in their opinion, unnecessary attention to students that may or may not be ones looking to stay. What the crux of the issue really has been around the increase for students. The students, in terms of that 504,000, that is the student migrants in the numbers are at 277, so well over half. Which it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the 504,000 was the new number, net migration number, and it says it's only 39% of the total, but it's actually over half if you look at that. Long-term immigration of non-EU nationals. Okay, that's non-EU nationals of that total, 277,000 out of the 504. what the Home Secretary has said quite publicly, in a very derogatory way, has claimed that it's not just the students that are included in these numbers, is that there's been a sharp increase in dependents that the students have been bringing with them, that have also what she calls bringing in family members who can piggyback onto their student visas, and in so doing are quote unquote propping up, frankly, substandard courses in inadequate institutions. Yeah, that's what you want your Home Secretary to say. Certainly not a very wise political statement to make, but again, this Home Secretary has been one who's gotten herself in trouble in the previous administration, previous government under Boris Johnson, and briefly his successor. So we're seeing some real kind of foot and mouth disease, I think, happening in the UK, and I know that's a hotly charged phrase in the UK, foot and mouth and mad cow and all that wonderful stuff. But certainly comparisons have been drawn to the kinds of rhetoric coming out of Number 10 that certainly gives university representatives and international educators in UK universities a lot of pause about what's happening. And that's there. The questions are really are there all these extra dependents of students, and these are mostly at the graduate level, so potentially folks who have families that are bringing their spouses and children with them so they can do a postgrad degree in the UK. So that seems fairly understandable, but certainly it's not drawing a lot of sympathy from the Home Office or the current UK government. The ITV News article I put certainly covers a lot of the language coming out of the current government, but there's also a piece from The Guardian where the cap that might be put in place on international students and their visas could, in the kind of warning signs, could send UK universities over the edge, and that the challenge is what Number 10 has refused to indicate what they think these low quality, what do they call them, low quality degrees at these low quality degrees at inadequate institutions might mean. That's obviously making a lot of university officials going to step up and take notice, and that might be something that we think about. Like obviously outside of the elite Russell Group institutions, those would probably be protected from this kind of cap, and clearly not the inadequate institutions. But we see the challenge being here in the UK now is damage control on the part of the universities, that having to make the case, as I mentioned earlier, to remove student visas from the net migration numbers, even though the families that come along with students at the postgrad level may be more inclined to stay if they're making that commitment to come for a 1 year or 2 year, 3 year degree, that they're making that effort. So we see a lot of challenges moving forward with the UK, and certainly no real solutions in sight. At least that none that have been proposed. So we'll keep an eye on that situation for you. But we look at what's happening there as a real challenge to the UK, who, if you've been following the news lately in the last couple of years, they've come out of the pandemic better than probably any other country on an all-around scheme in terms of they've seen increases in Chinese students for the first year or two of the pandemic. They've didn't have the real visa challenges that the U.S. has had, that Canada has had, that Australia has had with China. They've seen increases in Indian students. In fact, Indian students are now in the UK are now considered the dominant, or have surpassed new Indian students, surpassed new Chinese students coming into the UK this year. So that's the first time that's happened. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics going on in the UK, a lot of positive momentum. We knew right before the pandemic that they had a strategic plan by 2030 to hit 600,000 international students, and they'd already hit that prior to the pandemic. So they came down a little bit as everybody did in fall of 20, but then have built back up in 21 and 22. So they're on their way. They're talking about a new strategic plan, a new UK universities champion, potentially a new not advisory board, but governing board that helps develop a future international ed strategy for the UK. So there's been a lot of positive things that have been building, in addition to all the new non-EU students that have been coming to the UK, China and India driving the majority of that growth. They've obviously lost a lot with Brexit in terms of their EU market, down 50, 60, 70% over the last 2 years. So they've had to look at other markets to help keep their tuition dollars flowing in, because obviously the European market students weren't paying, were basically paying the equivalent of UK resident rates, and just have the extra housing charges that would be normal, the same for everybody. But you see what's happening with UK now. The politics are potentially getting in the way of this really good growth that they've experienced in the last couple of years, and stunting the momentum of recruitment initiatives, that particularly if there are limits on the postgrad student visas and the number of dependents that can come in with them. That risks separating families and really poses a significant challenge for universities that are considered inadequate, if they ever define that, which I hope they don't. But that would be a really interesting decision if and when they ever indicate what qualifies as an inadequate institution in the UK to host international students, at least. So we'll keep an eye on that one. But that is a warning sign, I think, that shows all of us, and I think we saw that in the in the U.S. here, certainly with the election of President Trump in 2016. His inaugural address in January of 2017, where the Muslim travel bans came down and clearly made a negative impression of the the U.S. at that time. And you see something similar happening here. If and when these postgrad students that are coming in from different countries and bringing family members, if they're all of a sudden now going to be in a race to try and get in and can only apply to certain institutions, and if there's a limit on them, how they're going to be factored in. A simple solution, if the UK government ever sees the light of day on this one, I don't know if they will, or gives it the light of day, to remove international students from the net migration numbers, because they're it's not a category that is clearly they're coming here to stay. There may be only half of them or less that might stay. I think the recent numbers I saw for graduates that were taking up the postgrad work or post-study work visa were under 40% that were actually taken up. I haven't seen recent numbers this past year, but that to include them in net migration numbers kind of is a false flag, I think, because they aren't in that category. They are the equivalent in the way the UK sees them, since there is a pathway it's the equivalent of the UK seeing all international. If the UK is saying that all international students are intended migrants to the UK, then that's the equivalent of us saying that international students that come here want to go on H-1B and then potentially stay are also included in net migration numbers. We don't have the equivalent really here in the U.S. We know we're bringing in more people are coming to the U.S. every year than are leaving that, substantially more. So that's a real challenge, and you hear one of the secretaries in the government in the UK is saying, when it comes to this growth, net migration, if we're going to reduce numbers, we can't reduce it so far that we're in negative territory, because we need migration in order to grow. So it's an economic reality that the UK is facing, that they need migrants to grow their country, to support the economy, in order to maintain quality of life and the standards that they have in the UK. So we'll see what happens with this, but it's potentially bad news for UK universities if they don't get this issue sorted. But I wish them luck, because students really shouldn't be in that net migration number. So I agree with that completely. We don't count them in the United States in net migration numbers, because they are in a non-immigrant visa category. That's just the way we've categorized them. I would hope, even with H-1Bs in the U.S., that's a dual intent. You can be here just to work for 3, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years max, or you could be on a pathway to immigration. It's not and even a defined part of that visa category. It can be one or the other. So H-1Bs wouldn't even be counted in that mix as intended migrants to the U.S. So we hope that someday F1 students can be considered dual intent, so they have that option and don't have to prove at age 18 that they're what they want to do for the rest of their life, and that when they're done with their degree, they're definitely going home even after they're done with work experience. That we hope that they can become dual intent, so that those questions don't prevent quality students and who can afford to come from being able to do so. So that's always been our argument in the U.S., that they should be able to come at least in that dual intent category, which is like an H-1B, but not like what they're considering in the U.K., that they're all defined by their nature as, even though they're students coming to finish do a degree, that doesn't automatically mean they're going to stay. But they have an option to, but it's not a defined part of that visa status in the UK. But the government's counting them as if they are. But that's something for the Brits to decide. But just to give perspective on what that could mean for the U.S., we welcome immigrants. We always have, though certain presidents have taken different views on how welcoming we'll be to folks from different parts of the world. Certainly, that is our who we are as a nation. We're founded on immigrants. I'm an immigrant to the U.S. When I was 5 years old, I came on an L2, intracompany transfer dependent visa. So I was an international student when I was in kindergarten here in the U.S. But when my family made that decision to come, it was with the intent, if things worked out, we could stay. And we did. And we've made the U.S. our home for the last 54 years. 53 years currently. Well, no, that's how old I am. So we're talking for the last 48 years. So it's really a time that in the world history, and certainly our country's history, certainly the UK is dealing with this issue of on the movement of people from unprecedented world events, when you had Ukraine and Hong Kong issues as they've had in the UK, in terms of migrant populations coming in because of wars and economic issues and other recent developments. So we'll see what happens, but we wish our friends in the UK higher ed luck, and hopefully that the government won't muck this up, because they do have a good thing going. I wish them the best in sorting that out. So on to question number 2. Where are Chinese students going these days? And we've just touched on one of the major destinations is the UK. They have seen a huge spike in Chinese students, particularly in the first year of the pandemic, after the first year of the pandemic in 2021. They made the visa process very simple, very straightforward. We also saw challenges that we experienced here in the United States. We saw a lot of challenges with visa availability in the first year of the pandemic. Embassies and consulates were closed in China. This past year, they've been, particularly the past summer, they were open. They were open and available for students to come on visa appointments, for visa appointments without huge delays. Less than 2 days wait for a student visa appointment throughout China last year. The challenge has been the numbers haven't been there to pre-pandemic levels yet. They are still under a lot of restrictions, but somehow a lot of them got out and were able to get to the UK this past year. What we see this current fall in the UK, the Chinese numbers overall, I think, are down a bit. I think that everybody's seen that, and I think that's in large part due to due to challenges in within China. And an article that I've posted into the chat that you'll see here in a second from Wes is actually their takes on what's happening with open doors data and that type of thing. So that shows a little bit of where they're coming from. But they do have a section on the continued decline in U.S. In Chinese students coming to the U.S. So even though the overall numbers are up this past year, what it does show, and the reason I focus on this article is there is a chart in there that charts Chinese students in top Anglophone destination markets, including U.S., Australia, Canada, and the U.K. There aren't current numbers for the UK this fall, but we do have. You see the from that chart, you'll see the UK numbers. They kind of peaked in 2019. Overall, 1920, and then have dropped off precipitously since then. In Australia, you saw similar. US still has far and away. I think we've got double what, but just under double what the UK had as of last fall. Then you see Canada also having a drop during the pandemic from China, but they may be seeing a rebound with opening up a little bit there. Maybe not after Prime Minister Trudeau had a little bit of a falling out publicly with President Xi at a recent summit. So we'll see what happens there. But Australia is still struggling to regain the Chinese market. 28% of Chinese students that are enrolled in Australian institutions are still in China, again reflecting that inability to get back to finish their degrees. So we'll see what happens there. But China, in terms of a market, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. Are they going to return to the U.S.? And the hope is yes. And I still am very positive about this. We have seen some indications that things are beginning to open up, at least in terms of willingness of travel restrictions internally within China are being improved slightly. There's still widespread lockdowns in certain regions. In Shenzhen, you've got Urumqi that's been under lockdown for over 100 days. The recent apartment fire there that killed 10 people is largely being blamed on pandemic restrictions and preventing emergency vehicles from getting there in a timely fashion. You've seen what that's done in terms of protests, unheard of protests across China that against the lockdown measures that have led to unnecessary deaths. Even though as they are seeing COVID spikes, there's fears that the vaccinations that they've been getting in China haven't been of the highest quality, and that's leading to more infection rates. We already know in the U.S. that just because you're vaccinated, fully vaccinated and boosted, that doesn't mean you're never going to get it. It just means your symptoms will be a little bit lighter. I think we've realized it's endemic now. It's not a pandemic anymore. It's here to stay, and there'll be variations on COVID that will be around for years. But it's one that we're managing. People are still dying, yes, but unfortunately that deaths would occur because of the flu. Deaths occur because of other diseases and viruses that pop up from time to time. It's unfortunately something that has become endemic in the U.S. and we're managing it. China is with the zero COVID policy. We know what that's done. It's hurt their economy. It's hurting production on. Talk about supply chain issues that come from China. That's part of the reason with lockdowns. That, for example, the Foxconn factory in the eastern part of the country that has been under serious lockdowns. They've just had some of that lifted. That was impacting share prices of Apple, for goodness sakes, because that's where some of the iPhones are made. So there's a lot of challenges here, and I go back to one of the most important books I ever read was The World is Flat by Tom Friedman, just talking about those supply chain issues and how everything is connected across the world. And this is something that expands beyond viruses and beyond borders clearly. and the impacts are global. And China has kind of suffered under that the last almost 3 years now. So as we look at China as a source market for students, we know that they are still the largest overall. They're becoming, as the new international numbers showed in the U.S. this past year and in the U.K. that we just shared a link on, India has surpassed China in both the U.S. and the U.K. as far as new international students coming. And that crossover, China's been in the lead for over 15 years, or at least 10 years at least, as the number one source of international students in the U.S. India will surpass China this year. Can China come back? Yes, but will it be to the same volumes we had in 2017, 18, 19? Probably not. I don't think that'll get that close. Well, part of the reason for that, and as we talk about where the Chinese students going, is we know that they have many more options beyond just the Anglophone countries. We know that for mainland Chinese students, Hong Kong is becoming increasingly a preferred option. Other East Asia centers, hubs, university hubs in Malaysia, in Singapore are becoming more popular. But Chinese students are expanding to other countries as well. They're going to Germany because the education is free. They're going to other countries as well in Europe that we need to be aware of. They have more options now than they did 10, 15 years ago. That's really funneled them almost exclusively to these Anglophone countries. They've got more options. So we just know that it's an increasingly competitive game out there. The pie has gotten a lot bigger in terms of the number of students that are studying abroad, not just in China, but around the world. But those students that want to go outside their home countries, they might not go halfway around the world. They might go somewhere to a regional hub that's within a couple hours flight from their home, as something that's a little bit more of a safer bet for them, so to speak. So we take a look at all of these questions every year, and we've shared before about how we really see in China. I shared some of this last week that I think China is going to rebound. I think the appetite for study abroad is vast in China. We know that the indicators from folks on the ground there seem to be pointing in the right direction. We know the Chinese government is eager to improve relations with the U.S., particularly with U.S. universities that they've become so reliant on as a way to send their talented youngsters abroad to receive high quality education and bring those skills back to China. And that's something we do know, is that the greater majority of Chinese students that come to the U.S. will take their degree, when they're done with their degrees, will go home. There will be few, and 10, 15, 20% that might stay and do their OPT, might get into the H-1B pipeline and become permanent residents and citizens someday. But the greater majority do go home, and that's just a fact that we've come to understand in the U.S. And I think the Chinese universities see that as Chinese government and Chinese universities that are increasingly looking for partnerships. There are some universities that are very eager to partner, but the Chinese government throws up a lot of red tape, frankly. It's bureaucracy that gets in the way of a lot of quality relationships from forming, because they all have to be approved up the chain at the Ministry of Education, unless you know somebody who can cut through that red tape for you. So it's good to be connected, but with those connections comes oftentimes some challenges. So we'll see where those take us in the coming years. But Chinese students are going abroad in record numbers still, not just to the U.S. And we've seen drops. The U.K. has seen a little bit of a drop, but more of an upward tick from China. Canada's seen drops. Australia's seen drops. But they have many more options, and that's why they're going. They want their education abroad. They want to learn from the best and bring it home and become the best. That's their plan. That's how the Chinese government functions, is everything's with a longer-term vision in mind. And they've realized, I think, that there's been a lot of damage done in the last few years to their reputation, and they need to rebuild some bridges on both sides, frankly, in order for them to prosper again to the levels and to reach their longer-term goals that they have. So we'll see where that takes us in the years to come. Last thing, quickly, I'll finish with are law schools going rogue? And this is a fun one. A little bit of a clickbait, but hey, you're not clicking on this one just for the story. Law schools in the United States have increasingly started to buck the trends or buck the ranking system and bucking requirements for testing. So it's interesting. We had two stories this week, both from Inside Higher Ed that shared that law schools are beginning to reject the U.S. news rankings, and they're doing so for a number of different reasons, but it's being led, thankfully, by the ones that are typically at the top of the list. So Berkeley, Columbia, Georgetown, Stanford joined the movement started by Harvard and Yale to boycott, basically, for lack of a better word. Even though Yale has been at the top of the list for years, they consider it. This is the Yale's law dean, Heather Gerken, has called the rankings profoundly flawed. They disincentivize programs that support public interest careers, champion need-based aid, and welcome working class students into the profession. And that is perfect. I love that rationale because when you think about it, and it's coming from Yale, which produces Supreme Court justices and federal circuit court judges, and some of the more prominent legal minds in the United States are graduates of Yale Law School. So when you have the top law school in the country saying that, hey, these rankings aren't what we should be about. We should be about the public service side of things, and talking about first gen, and talking about need-based aid, and working class students that want to become lawyers. All of that is something that is encouraging to see coming out of law schools, and top law schools for that matter. So you've got, on one hand, you've got these top law schools rejecting the rankings, and you also have the ABA, the American Bar Association. Had a panel that voted to lift test requirements starting in 2025. But the group's governing body still needs to approve the change. In that panel that was assessing whether the LSAT should still be required, the LSAT being the GRE being the test that most law schools will take, they voted to remove that. Currently ABA allows law schools to use either LSAT or GRE, but by 2025, this panel has recommended that LSAT be made optional. That law schools have the ability to be test optional. So it's interesting to see this. It's the Strategic Review Committee. And talked about the importance of access, and that seemed to be one of the cases for why it should not be. And it's kind of a little bit rich, but that by removing the LSAT, it's removing access for. In fact, the 60 law deans which represents fewer than 1/3 of the total, wrote to the council that made this decision that they worried that the change would hurt minority applicants. They wrote that the change would diminish the diversity of law schools' incoming classes by increasing reliance on grade point average and other criteria that are potentially more infused with bias, blah, blah, blah. At the very least, we believe that more data on study on the effects of the precipitous change are needed. So interesting to see that. And obviously, international students, when they're considering law in the United States, 95% of them aren't coming for JDs. So it's really not that big of an issue. You do get some of those that have permanent residency, international students that come in and want to go to law school eventually. So that might happen, or they get married and they want to become a lawyer in the U.S. That happens. We've had that happen at UNLV. But this is part of what I see. The whole test optional movement and increasing access, kind of quite the contrary of what these 60 law school deans are saying in terms of removing access. So we'll see what happens with this, but I'm heartened by this test optional movement affecting law schools as well. Certainly think when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and access at our institutions, nothing gets in the way more of these kind of access to our particularly our graduate programs than some of these onerous test requirements that we have. So let's hope that gains some momentum in the coming years. So that's effective 2025, so still 3 years off. So that's all we have for you today on the Midweek Roundup. We appreciate you bearing with us today, and we wish you all the very best in the days and weeks ahead. Thanks very much.